The silence was deafening as he stood at the edge of the stage, feeling the weight of 100 eyes burning into his skin. Thomas clutched the edges of his navy blue blazer, the fabric straining slightly against his rounded frame. The uniform, that was supposed to make everyone equal somehow, made him stand out even more. He could feel the vibrations of whispers through the floorboards, even if he couldn't hear them. In 12 years of life, he had learned to read a room without sound. The annual Harvest Festival at St. Gabriel's Academy was the most important event of the fall semester. Every student was expected to participate in some way, singing in the choir, reciting poetry, or performing instrumental pieces. Thomas had been placed at the very back of the choir, hidden behind taller students, his presence an afterthought. The choir director had made it clear, through exaggerated hand gestures and pitying glances, that Thomas should just mouth the words and try not to draw attention. Mrs. Phelps, the music teacher, tapped her baton against the music stand, her lips forming words Thomas couldn't hear. The other children moved in unison, stepping forward in their crisp white shirts and navy bottoms. Thomas remained frozen, a half-second behind, always watching for cues rather than hearing them. A snicker rippled through the back row as he fumbled to catch up. "That's enough for today," Mrs. Phelps's lips read, her expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "Thomas, please stay after practice." The other students filed out, some casting glances over their shoulders. Wesley Matthews, with his perfect hair and athletic build, whispered something that made a cluster of girls giggle. Thomas didn't need to hear it to know it was about him. "Thomas," Mrs. Phelps said, exaggerating her mouth movements as if volume was the issue, not his profound deafness. "I'm not sure the choir is the best place for you. Have you considered helping with the backstage crew instead?" Thomas's hands moved automatically, forming signs that Mrs. Phelps couldn't understand. Realizing his mistake, he pulled out the small notebook he always carried in his pocket, a gift from his grandmother on his 7th birthday. Its leather cover was worn smooth from years of use, the pages filled with his observations and thoughts. "I want to participate," he wrote carefully. "Please give me a chance." Mrs. Phelps smiled, that particular smile adults used when they pitied him. "Of course, dear, but perhaps in a way that's more suitable." That evening, Thomas sat at the dinner table, pushing peas around his plate, while his mother and father exchanged concerned glances. His younger sister, Rachel, chattered about her day, her hands flying in animated signs that matched her spoken words. Their family functioned in 2 languages, spoken English and sign language, bridging the gap between Thomas's silent world and the hearing one. "They're saying I should work backstage," Thomas signed, his movements sharp with frustration. "Because I'm deaf, because I'm fat, because I don't fit." His mother's hands moved gently in response. "You fit right here with us, always." "School is different," Thomas replied. His father put down his fork. "Son, people fear what they don't understand. Your deafness makes them uncomfortable because they don't know how to connect with you." "It's not just that," Thomas signed, his fingers betraying his emotion. "Wesley and his friends call me Chubby Thomas when they think I can't see them. They leave notes in my backpack." His mother's face hardened. "I'm calling the school tomorrow." "No!" Thomas's hands moved emphatically. "That will make it worse." That night, as Thomas lay in bed, he pulled out his notebook and wrote by the glow of his bedside lamp, "Things they don't see." 1. The way sunlight changes color through the stained glass in the chapel. 2. How Mrs. Phelps's eyes light up when someone gets a note perfectly right. 3. The small acts of kindness between strangers in the hallway. 4. Wesley's hands shaking before he gives presentations. 5. The hidden pain behind Principal Abernathy's stern face when he thinks no one is looking. Thomas had always been observant. Without sound to distract him, he noticed details others missed. His notebook was filled with these observations, beautiful, painful, honest things that existed in the margins of everyday life. Sometimes he sketched what he couldn't describe, his untrained hand capturing emotions rather than precise images. The next morning, a notice appeared on the school bulletin board. Special presentation for Founders' Day, student testimonials. What St. Gabriel's means to me. All students must participate. A knot formed in Thomas's stomach. Public speaking was the one thing worse than choir. At least in the choir, he could blend in. A presentation meant standing alone, exposed to judgment. During lunch, Thomas sat at his usual table near the window. He preferred this spot because the natural light made it easier to read lips if anyone actually spoke to him. Usually, no one did. Today was different. A lunch tray clattered onto the table across from him. Sophia Chen, a quiet girl from his mathematics class, slid into the seat. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her uniform was impeccably pressed. Thomas had noticed her before. She was one of the few students who didn't stare or whisper about him. "Hi," she mouthed, then surprised him by forming a simple greeting in sign language. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. He signed back, "You know sign language?" Sophia smiled and signed, "A little. My cousin is deaf. I'm learning." For the first time in months, Thomas felt a flutter of connection. Someone who tried to enter his world rather than forcing him to navigate theirs. "Are you nervous about the Founders' Day presentation?" she asked, her signing limited but earnest. Thomas nodded, pulling out his notebook to write. "I don't know what to say. No one will want to listen to me anyway." Sophia read his words and shook her head firmly. She wrote beneath his sentence, "I would." A week passed, and the preparations for Founders' Day intensified. Students huddled in corners, practicing their speeches. Wesley boasted loudly about how his father, a successful businessman and major donor to the school, had helped him craft the perfect testimony. Thomas worked on his presentation alone in the chapel during lunch breaks. The space was usually empty, and he found comfort in the colorful light filtering through the stained glass windows. He would stand at the lectern, practicing the signs he planned to use, mouthing words he would never hear. His testimony took shape slowly. Unlike the polished, performative speeches others were preparing, Thomas's was raw and honest. He wrote about silence, about seeing what others missed, about finding beauty in overlooked moments. Each day he added observations from his notebook, weaving them into a narrative about belonging and perception. On Wednesday afternoon, Thomas entered the chapel to find it wasn't empty. Principal Abernathy sat in the last pew, head bowed. Thomas hesitated, about to retreat, when the principal looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. Seeing Thomas, Principal Abernathy quickly composed himself. "Thomas, I didn't expect anyone here at this hour." Thomas held up his notebook, where he'd written, "I practice here. I'm sorry to intrude." "No intrusion," Principal Abernathy said, speaking slowly and clearly so Thomas could read his lips. "I was just taking a moment." Thomas nodded and turned to leave, but then paused. He flipped to a page in his notebook and showed it to the principal, a simple sketch of the chapel windows with a note. "The light here feels different, healing." Principal Abernathy studied the page, something shifting in his expression. "Yes," he said finally, "it does." He handed the notebook back. "Carry on with your practice, Thomas. I'll leave you to it." As the principal walked away, Thomas noticed his shoulders seemed less burdened than before. The day before Founders' Day, disaster struck. Thomas was reviewing his notes in the hallway when Wesley and two of his friends rounded the corner. "Well, if it isn't Chubby Thomas," Wesley said loudly, knowing Thomas couldn't hear him but saying it for his friend's benefit. "Practicing your little speech." Thomas tried to move past them, but Wesley blocked his path. With a quick motion, he snatched Thomas's notebook. "What's this? Your diary?" Wesley flipped through the pages, his expression changing from mockery to something darker as he read Thomas's private thoughts and observations, including the one about Wesley's shaking hands. "Give it back," Thomas signed, knowing Wesley wouldn't understand but desperate to communicate. Wesley's face flushed with anger. He ripped out several pages and crumpled them, tossing them to the floor before shoving the notebook against Thomas's chest. "You don't know anything about me," he mouthed exaggeratedly, making sure Thomas could understand. "You're pathetic." Thomas stood frozen as the boys walked away, laughing. He knelt to gather the crumpled pages, his vision blurring with tears. Among them was his testimony for Founder's Day, now wrinkled and torn. After school, Thomas sat on the steps of the chapel, trying to smooth the wrinkled pages and piece together his ruined presentation. A shadow fell across the paper. He looked up to find Sophia standing there. She sat beside him without a word, taking some of the crumpled pages and carefully flattening them. When she saw what they contained, her eyes widened. "This is beautiful," she signed, her movements becoming more confident with practice. Thomas shook his head and wrote in his notebook, "It's ruined now, and they'll laugh at me tomorrow." Sophia thought for a moment, then wrote beneath his words, "What if you don't just tell them? What if you show them?" Thomas looked at her questioningly. "Your words are powerful," she continued, "but maybe there's another way to make them understand." That night, Thomas barely slept. He reworked his presentation, following Sophia's suggestion, incorporating elements he'd never considered before. It was risky. He might fail spectacularly, but something in him had shifted. For once, he wasn't thinking about fitting in. He was thinking about being truly seen. Founder's Day dawned clear and bright. St. Gabriel's auditorium filled with parents, faculty, and students dressed in their best uniforms. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Thomas stood backstage, adjusting his blazer nervously. His parents and sister had arrived early, securing seats in the front row, where Thomas could easily see them. Wesley presented first, his speech polished and perfect, drawing enthusiastic applause. Several other students followed, each sharing carefully prepared testimonials about tradition, excellence, and the privilege of attending St. Gabriel's. When Thomas's name was called, a hush fell over the audience. He walked to center stage, acutely aware of the whispers and stares. The navy blazer felt tight across his shoulders, the white socks stark against his black shoes. He stood alone in the spotlight, separate from the choir that flanked the stage in formation. For an excruciating moment, Thomas froze. From the front row, his sister Rachel gave him a subtle thumbs up. Sophia, seated with the choir, nodded encouragingly. Thomas took a deep breath and began to sign. No voice accompanied his movements, just the eloquent dance of his hands through the air. On the screen behind him, his words appeared in projected text, a surprise arrangement Sophia had helped him set up with the reluctant assistance of the technology teacher. "My St. Gabriel's is silent," the screen read, as his hands formed the signs. "But silence isn't empty. It's full of everything most people miss." The audience stirred uncomfortably. This was not the typical testimony they expected. Thomas continued, his signs becoming more fluid as he gained confidence. "I see St. Gabriel's differently than most of you. I see the light in the chapel shifting 12 times between 8 o'clock and noon. I see kindness in corners where no one is looking. I see pain behind perfect smiles." The screen changed to show some of Thomas's sketches, simple but powerful renderings of school life from his perspective. The stained glass windows, a lonely figure on a playground, hands reaching out to help someone up. "I've written down 365 things of beauty I've seen at this school that no one else has noticed," Thomas signed. "Because when you can't hear, you learn to really see." The audience was completely still now, all eyes fixed on the unusual presentation unfolding before them. Thomas reached the hardest part, the story he had decided to share. "Yesterday, someone tore up my notebook because I saw something about him he didn't want seen. He was afraid." The projection showed the crumpled papers, now carefully smoothed. "I was angry at first, then I realized something." Thomas paused, his hands momentarily still. Then he signed a short, powerful sentence. "Fear makes us destroy what we don't understand." What happened next wasn't in Thomas's plan. Wesley stood up from his seat in the front row. His face was flushed, eyes glistening. To everyone's shock, he walked onto the stage. For a terrifying moment, Thomas thought Wesley might humiliate him further. Instead, Wesley did something extraordinary. With halting, imperfect movements, he began to sign. "I'm sorry." His clumsy signs read, clearly recently learned but sincere. The auditorium collectively gasped. Wesley, the model student, the principal's son, stood vulnerably before the entire school, attempting to speak Thomas's language. "My father is dying," Wesley signed slowly, each movement clearly difficult for him. "Cancer. I was afraid. I still am." Thomas stared at Wesley in disbelief. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Suddenly, Wesley's perfect facade, his need to control, his cruelty, it all made terrible sense. In that moment, Thomas made a choice that would define him more than any testimony could. He stepped forward and helped guide Wesley's hands through the signs, teaching him even as they communicated. Together, they faced the audience, the chubby, deaf boy and the school's golden child, finding a common language in their shared humanity. "This is what St. Gabriel's should be," Thomas signed as Wesley attempted to follow along. "Not a place where we're all the same, a place where we all belong." Principal Abernathy, Wesley's father, stood from his seat, tears streaming openly down his face now. He walked slowly to the stage, joining his son. The three stood together as Thomas continued his testimony, now telling a different story. One about fear and courage, about seeing and being seen. "In the chapel," Thomas signed, "there's a window that shows the parable of the lost sheep. One sheep, separated from 99 others, is sought by the shepherd who won't rest until it's found." His hands formed the shapes of his words with grace and power. "We're all lost sometimes. We all need to be found." As Thomas finished his testimony, Rachel ran to the stage with his notebook. She opened it to a blank page and handed him a pen. Thomas wrote in large letters that everyone could see on the projection screen. "The sound most worth hearing isn't made with voices. It's made when hearts recognize each other." There was no applause when Thomas finished. Something deeper had happened. One by one, students began to stand. First Sophia, then others in the choir, then parents and teachers. A standing ovation without a single clap, just hands raised and waving in the air, the deaf applause that recognized Thomas in his own language. That evening, as families mingled at the reception, Thomas sat with his parents, still processing what had happened. Principal Abernathy approached their table, Wesley beside him. "Thomas," the principal said, his usually commanding voice gentle, "thank you for what you did today." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond. Wesley stepped forward, holding something out to Thomas. It was a notebook, brand new, bound in soft leather similar to Thomas's own. "I bought this," Wesley signed haltingly, clearly having practiced these specific movements, "for your next 365 observations." Thomas accepted the gift, opening it to find an inscription on the first page. "Thank you for seeing me, W." In the weeks that followed, things changed at St. Gabriel's. A sign language club formed, with Sophia and surprisingly Wesley among its first members. Thomas found himself no longer invisible, no longer just the chubby, deaf boy pushed to the back. During the Christmas concert the following month, Thomas stood center stage. The choir surrounded him in a semicircle, their voices rising in song while their hands moved in unison, signing the lyrics so Thomas could participate fully. His sighs and his silence were no longer things that separated him. They were simply part of who he was, accepted and valued. As Thomas looked out at the audience, he saw Principal Abernathy, thinner now, but with a peaceful expression that hadn't been there before. Wesley stood beside his father, supporting him with a steady hand. Thomas understood then that some burdens couldn't be seen, and some strength came from places no one expected. That night, Thomas added a new entry to his notebook, the 366th observation of beauty he'd witnessed at St. Gabriel's. "Today, we made a new sound together. Not with our voices, but with our hands and hearts. Even in silence, we were heard. He closed the notebook, running his fingers over the worn leather of his original journal and the smooth cover of Wesley's gift. 2 books, one containing his past observations, one waiting for future ones, like stepping stones across a river, leading him forward. Thomas had entered St. Gabriel's as an outsider, marked by his differences. He would continue his journey there as simply Thomas, still deaf, still carrying extra weight, but now carrying something else too, the knowledge that being seen, truly seen, was a kind of miracle. And that sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't about what you've overcome, but about how you've helped others see differently. In the silence of his world, Thomas had found his voice. And in that voice, others had found a kind of healing, a reminder that we all long to be found when we're lost, to be sought when we've strayed, to be valued not despite our differences, but because of the unique perspective they bring. The shepherd, after all, didn't love the lost sheep because it was lost, but because it was his. Every one of us, Thomas now understood, belonged to something larger than ourselves. And in that belonging was a kind of music even he could hear.